All right, it's being recorded now. Cool. So as I was saying, if you have any questions at any point in time about the presentation or something I've said, or even if you want more information about something, I'm happy to follow up and send stuff out to the class or out to whoever needs it down the line. But this is the funnest part about data analytics. Writing code and like writing and dealing with Excel spreadsheets and writing formulas, that's all stuff that I don't find very fun. I find design fun. I find creating something cool to be pretty fun. Oh, someone else join?
Sorry, yes, I was having technical difficulties, but I am here now.
Oh, hi. Cool.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, Eric.
Sweet. Do you mind muting your mic?
I'm trying to figure it out now.
Okay.
I think I'm...
Cool. I can mute you too, if you want. Okay, looks like you're good. Sweet, thank you so much, Eric. All right, so, can't minimize Zoom, that's fine. Okay, so I'm going to now turn to my presentation, which can be shared out to you guys later. Let's see, how do I, one moment while I figure that out. Oh, stop video.
Should just see the share screen at the bottom there.
Oh, I see, yep. There we go. Cool. So, great. Everyone can see that okay? Sweet. Cool. So again, today I'm going to talk to you guys about data visualization, why and how, why it's important, different mechanisms for visualizing your data, and some best practices to keep in mind as you go about building out charts or building out PowerPoint decks or building out dashboards, really anything. As Joe alluded to before, data visualization is incredibly impactful, and it's going to touch a lot of different areas, whether it be you're working in healthcare, or you're working with a small business, or you're working with even like students from time to time. How people see and understand data is more relevant now than it ever was before. You open the paper and you see a visualization about the New York Times and election results, and then you have an understanding about what's going on in the world. All of those things are really cool to think about. So again, I'll start off with talking a little bit more about why we visualize certain things and the meaning that it can have. I'll then move along to some methods and platforms that can be used to visualize your data. There are a wide variety of tools that you can use, ranging from easy to hard. And then we'll talk a little bit about data considerations, which are applicable to whatever tool that you use. And then lastly, visual best practices. So, all right, so as you can see, why is visualization important? In my mind, data is really ugly. So the first picture here that I have is of a bunch of cells. That's ugly, right? It's not very pretty to look at. It's a bunch of cells. I guess if you're into that type of geometric shapes and whatnot, that's cool. But the flower in one hand is much prettier. In the same way at the bottom, as Joe mentioned before, looking at the big spreadsheet is just completely unmanageable. You can't really infer anything from it. So because you have this chart or you have this visualization, or viz as we call it in the visualization world, you're able to uncover some patterns, drill into information. It's not just static. It's not just in the Excel spreadsheet. You can convey better messages to people that are able to then take away immediately what they need to understand from the data. And then they themselves, the decision makers or yourself or whoever your team is that you're working with, can infer meaningful insights. So whether it is a spike in a certain shoe sale in China, or whether it's a decline in meaningful conversations with HR, all of those things are really important to understand, and you can't just get it from the raw data or the raw numbers. So again, images affect perception. In my mind, I see a lot of things that come out of visualization practices that can be pretty untruthful. So I have a book right now. Well, I've had it for a couple of years, but it's called How to Lie with Maps. And as you can see in the bottom left corner and in the top right, there are two different maps there, and they all kind of convey different things to different people that look at them. So if you recall from the election, or really any time you look at a political map, you see this wide, very large portion of the US that's just all red. And anyone that was not familiar with population distribution across the US would see this map and be like, the US is all red, that's it, 90%. But if you come to think about it a little bit more and you understand where the population is distributed amongst the United States, you understand that those little pockets of blue are actually much more populated than pockets of red. So things like that, maps in particular, can be very misleading. And then the one in the top right corner, where we have all these pinpoints of crimes committed throughout Germany, it seems like there's just a ton of crime, like crime everywhere in Germany. But we don't actually know what those pinpoints mean, and we don't know how many there are really. Well, I guess it says there on the little text, but regardless of that, someone could look at that and just completely draw some conclusion that that isn't really even factual at the end of the day. So, and then the bottom one in the right corner, that is sourced, and I think actually the one above that too, from this really great Tumblr. Excuse my vague French, but it's called WTF Viz, and it's just all of these data visualizations that this person compiles that are just awful and bad and make no sense. So in the one in the bottom right-hand corner, we see it's a pie chart, but those percentages don't even add up to 100%. So it's really confusing when you look at it. And it doesn't really convey the message that I think the creator of that was trying to visualize at the end of the day. So all of those things are really important to understand whenever you're building a chart, and we'll get into some of those best practices a little bit later, but it's always really important to keep in mind that whoever sees the visualization that you are creating just needs to see the facts and not fluff, or not an excessive amount of red where there shouldn't be red, or an excessive amount of pinpoints where you're not even able to understand where the high volume of the crimes are, or even if there is a high volume of crimes. So things like that are important to keep in mind. So images affect perception. And then perception, again, determines action. So on the right here, we have, let's see, this is the stock market crash. And imagine you were presented only with the top graph, and you see, the stocks are on the rise. And you're like, oh, America's doing great. But then you take it back and see the prior, what is that, couple months, and you can see that drastic drop in terms of stock and in terms of value in the US, and that's specifically when the stock market crashed. But if you don't have that full picture, you're not able to really assess what was going on at the time. So that type of context is really impactful and very important as well. And then on the right, we have, again, being a somewhat earthquake nerd at our company, I'm actually on our earthquake preparedness team, so I help everyone kind of understand and build their earthquake kits and whatnot, which is really fun. So on the right, you can see we have these two maps in relation to earthquakes, the top one being from the entire United States point of view. And you can see where the hazards are, and you would look at if you were super afraid of earthquakes, you would look at the West Coast and be like, oh, not living there, that's not happening. But it's just all relative, so if you were to live in Portland, which is the map on the bottom, which is pretty low resolution, so I apologize for that, you can see that in Portland, actually, well, if you live in like North Portland, and if you live in certain parts of the city, you really won't be that impacted by an earthquake or by the big one. You'll be impacted, but not in the same way that you would be, say, if you lived in Northwest, which is why I don't live there. But it's just all relative, so it's really important to think about that, because if, say, you saw that top map and said, I'm not going to live on the West Coast, that's completely different than if you saw the bottom one and said, well, parts of Portland are actually safe. So that type of action that can result from whatever visualization that you're seeing is so important, and it really determines decisions. And you want to make sure that whoever's seeing it has the best information and the best visual representation of what the decision is that they're trying to make. So that's really fun to think about in my mind. All right, so if anyone doesn't have any questions about kind of the theory behind data visualizations. I can move on to some platforms. I don't see any hands raised. Cool. So there are 1.5 million data visualization platforms on the market right now. And there are, half of those are free and not so great. Well, I guess a third of those. Another third are free and require a lot of coding, whether it be JavaScript, R, Python, etc., SQL, which is the second column right here. And then some of them are enterprise-wide, or you'd have to pay for. And the cool thing that I've seen happen over the past 7 or so years is that a lot of these open source platforms are actually moving at a quicker pace than the ones that you have to pay for, which is neat. So it's always good to kind of keep your eye on the market and watch out for what's out there. But again, almost any time you use an open source tool, it's going to require a bit more finagling. It's going to potentially have security issues and a couple of other things that you'd want to watch out for when using it. But I've made a lot of really cool things using things like Google Sheets and Google Charts. I've made a lot of sweet things using tools like Mapbox and QGIS, Excel as well. So when you look at all of those different type of tools that you can use, it's really important to consider if you are willing to invest money in whatever it is, if Excel just gets you by, if Power BI, which actually is also free, if you have certain rights to other Microsoft products like Excel. Those things are all really important. And then on top of that, you also have to consider which ones have the best visual components. So Excel, I'm sure you guys up to this point have played around in Excel with the different charts and whatnot that it can create. Depending on which version you use, it can be very elegant. Some versions are not so great. But you can still get the point across and you can still convey the message that you want to. The paid platforms, which are ones that can be scaled on an enterprise level, that I see a lot of companies requesting applicants or requesting new candidates for jobs for, are always paid, and then they come with a larger package and a server so they can put their data visualizations and their BI stuff on the web and have a portal for, say, sales analysts to come into and look at. So things like Tableau, which is our tool of choice in our group, which is great. Domo, which is also kind of along those lines, and Click and MicroStrategy. Power BI as well, but Power BI is free, so it's pretty nice. All of these different things can do a really wide variety of visualizations and make some really cool and compelling things for clients. And I'll show you a couple of Tableau visualizations in a bit, but that's kind of the king of the market at the moment. And then here on the right, we have the Gartner Magic Quadrant, which Gartner is a software ratings company. Okay. Gartner is a software rating company, so you can see here they look to all of these BI platforms and they rate them based off of what they're doing and if they're things that companies shouldn't invest in, which again, it's always really important to look at these type of charts if you're trying to get a job in this field, because then it's good to know some of the components of the tool so you can speak to it and maybe get some experience by downloading a free trial version or using some of their kind of lower end, not as expensive tools, because experience in that in any of those really can propel your career at times. I've seen project managers that just pick up Tableau, or I know Joe has been messing around in Power BI as of recent. So those type of things can really help you understand what your analysts are going through, or what other people that are trying to build dashboards or trying to build visualizations are going through, and help you to frame that. And then potentially, if you want to get a career in it someday, that is really easy and accessible to do as well. So the Magic Quadrant is important. You can see Salesforce is on there too. Alteryx, which is one of my favorite tools for data blending, stuff like that is good. So when it comes to things to think about when you are starting to compile all of your data and put it into one spot, the most time that almost any analyst or any person that's building a visualization from scratch spends is on just data cleaning. And I'm sure you guys have, scraped data from the internet or pulled down sites from the government, and then you notice just, rows and rows that are nulls and date fields that aren't formatted correctly, or text that's just long strings and doesn't make any sense and aren't matching correctly. I've spent too many hours and too many nights of lost sleep on trying to clean data from time to time, and it's so excruciating to do, but it's really the only way that you can compile it in a right way, again, to meet those certain points that would create a compelling visual. Because you don't want a pie chart that has, red, green, and then just a block of null. Like, that doesn't really say anything, unless, I don't know, maybe you need to see the null to know that the data is not clean, which is also sometimes good. But regardless of that, data cleaning is excruciating. It takes a long time, but at the end of the day, it's worth it. And especially if you can automate the process through some of the tools that like Excel has to do that, or other things that are out there. I think Google actually has a couple of means to really clean up your data for you, which is nice if you have it like in Google Sheets. So with that in mind, there are a couple of different ways that data can then feed into a good visualization, and it really depends on the software that you're using. But there's the tabular way that you can look at a data, which, as you can see, the first table on the right, if you have like 3 fields, the first one has all of your dimensions. So like A and B, which say would be like Abby and Brittany, and then some of our scores there on the next 2 columns. And then the more column way that you can look at the data too is if you have the name and then the field name and then the field value, so that you could say like put that in a pivot chart and pivot the data to have the fields at the top. And the latter version, the one at the bottom, is typically the one that's I find preferable to use, but some other people prefer having their fields in all completely different columns, which is fine. And again, it really depends on the tool you're using. Again, with cleanliness, if you're going to join and blend data from other sources, it's really important to think about how you're joining the data together. So if you're familiar with like data joins, you can have like a left join in which one file is just taking the fields from another file and then combining it to that one primary source, so you're not duplicating any rows or anything like that. But if you do like an inner join, you have the potential to really blow out the data. So say if a value A and value A from like another field or another Excel spreadsheet are trying to be joined, let's see, I'm not explaining this very well, so I'm going to try again. So say you're doing a VLOOKUP, and I hope everyone knows what a VLOOKUP is in Excel, where you can look up from one column the value in another column based off of a shared attribute. So if you're looking up data in another column based off of that shared attribute, but there are multiple values that have that shared attribute, you're not going to get the right one, because there might be a second value further down in the spreadsheet that has the exact same value that you're trying to join with. So if you're joining the data and you have multiple values in the column that you're trying to join with, it'll blow out the data because it'll add a field or add a value for every single one in the spreadsheet. And that can be problematic at times, and it will cause people sometimes to mess up the analytics that they're trying to run. So just be careful for that if you're ever joining data from here or there. So, and then also when it comes to cleanliness, you really want to consider the data type. A lot of tools that are used whenever you bring in a date field requires the date field to be as a date and not, say, someone typing in, Jan 2, comma, or no comma, 1995, or have separate columns for the month, the date, and then the year. Dates are always really tricky, especially when you bring in time. And then also the difference between integers and strings. So an integer or a point value, things like that, those numbers versus whether or not they're text are also important to consider whenever you're bringing different data into a new tool. or whatnot. And then lastly, obviously percentages. You want to make sure that the tool that you're using knows that the percentage field is a percentage, so it's going to be 0.72 instead of 72 or whatnot. Just keeping those things in mind as you start to build something out is pretty good to do. I mean, even I mess up on all these things all the time, but that's what the back button is for, I suppose. So the other thing I wanted to note was just to make sure to know your sources. As a data visualization and data consultant, I see data coming at us from like every different direction all the times. So whether it be Excel, like an SAP database, Oracle database, in the cloud, so that would be something that's stored not on a server at a company, but rather in the cloud on, say, one of Amazon's servers somewhere, which is technically the cloud. All of these different sources here and there are important to consider when you start to really examine the truth behind your data, especially if you're working in like a nonprofit setting or you're trying to compile a research project. Testing and knowing the validity of that data, and then also knowing the compatibility of that data and how large it is and whether or not the tools that you're using are able to handle it. All of those things feed into the tool that you end up choosing and then the visualization that comes from it. So you wouldn't really be able to download a billion row data source from the government and then put that in Excel. Like Excel can only handle what, like 2 million rows maybe, I think. But then you blow out the file and then your performance is really poor on whatever it is that you're trying to do, and it slows down your computer. So things like that are important to consider. And in that instance, I would maybe think about using like Google Sheets or aggregating the data in a way that doesn't make the file so large. But it's just so fun for me anyways to think about and to have like a random question to scour the internet and try and find all these different cool data sources that can be used. There's actually a really great email listserv that's been going for about 2 or 3 years. It's done by this man called Jeremy Singer Vine, and it's called Data is Plural. So if you ever want to get a weekly email about cool new data sources, I would definitely recommend that, because you never know what's going to show up in it. I think like a couple of weeks ago they had one on like fruit exports in the United States, and then another one on like gummy bear flavors over the past 100 years. Just really random things that can be really fun to just play with and think about and then use as practice sources. And then they can also be useful. So if you're working again at a nonprofit and you are working at the Oregon Humane Society and you want to see global trends on, I don't know, cat sales, that might be on the internet somewhere. Like, that's really cool to think about. But again, you have to remember, like, is there validity behind that data? Has someone vetted it? Is it truthful? Is it actually real? I would say most of the stuff that's done by Jeremy is pretty much real. So it's really nice. Oh, and then the other one I was going to note, since we are in the Portland, most of us are in the Portland area, there's a really great website called Civic Apps, which you can see the logo is right there in the middle. And it's a website put out by Metro, I believe, that has just a plethora of data on the city. So one time I downloaded a data set on public art in Portland, and then put bike lanes behind that and tried to figure out like the best route that one could take on a bike to see all of the art in the city. Or they have, I remember they had the data set out there for those little poetry boxes that you sometimes see in Portland, where it's just a little box that someone has sitting in their front yard on a stick with the poem inside of it. I don't know who collects that stuff, but I guess it gets posted to Civic Apps, and it's just kind of fun to see the various data on our city if you live in Portland again. And then, the state of Oregon has a bunch of data on their government website too. A lot of GIS data if you want to get involved with mapping, things like that. But it's really cool. I don't know, data makes me so happy. Yeah, and I already alluded to how certain tools can only handle data from certain sources. So just be wary of that and the way it could impact performance or impact the tool that you're using. Big Excel spreadsheets are a nightmare when it comes to trying to do anything on your computer. So just watch out for that. Okay, so we've covered a little bit about the theory behind data visualization. We've covered some stuff on best practices in regards to data. And now we can talk a little bit about the best part, which is visualizing your data. So these two visuals, I'll start at the bottom because I think they're the most eye-catching components of this slide. You see, and I can send out some links to these two as well. Two data visualizations the one on the left is more about politics, and then the one on the right is about the Beatles, but they were both done in the tool that I use a lot called Tableau. And they are just pretty to look at and really eye-catching right away. And so I just wanted to put them out there as an inspiration. So as a consultant, whenever I am brought onto a new project and have to use new tools or have new data sources, and I'm trying to build out visualizations for clients and dashboards for clients, I really have to do this wonderful thing called requirements gathering, where I go around and I talk to the stakeholders involved, and I pretty much ask them all of these questions right here, because that will directly inform the design of the dashboard, the data that gets brought in, the visuals that need to be conveyed, the visuals that they're used to seeing, which is often important, and whatnot. So first off, what is your message or purpose? What is your hypothesis behind this data? Is it, I hypothesize that sales in China are going down because the styles of X, Y, or Z are just not popular enough on the whole. So if that were the case, and you wanted to see whether or not sales in China were going down because of certain styles of clothing, you'd want to have information on China on the whole, and then a chart that shows all of the styles ranking from, least to greatest or greatest to least or whatnot. So you could then understand where the styles start to, like, one or two tend to pop out, especially in comparison to like last year. Are there styles that aren't really aren't as popular, and that's why China is just suffering on the whole? Things like that. So is that the hypothesis? Is that the message? Is that the purpose of the thing that you're trying to build? That's important. And then who is your audience? So I love to think about, I'm always reminded that like when I was in, when I was applying to college, and even when I was in high school, middle school, and elementary, we had to take I'm from Iowa, so I took the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. One of the things that you get marked highly on is your inference of the graphs and whatnot that you were being presented with. And I remember, people saying that you should be able to look at something and understand and really grasp whatever it is that the chart was trying to say to you. And thinking about that now, I think of, that was easy if you have a mathematical mind, or if you are able to understand things visually, but that's not always the case with a lot of people. Some people are learners based off of other things, or some people just don't understand what's being said on the page because whoever made the Iowa Test of Basic Skills just sucked at visualization making. Who knows? So you really have to consider who is your audience when you're building these type of things. Do they like color? Are they colorblind? Do they like pie charts? Do they like bar charts? What type of thing will resonate with this particular audience? Will a map help? Are they geographically based people that really enjoyed seeing data in that capacity? Usually it's a yes, because people love geeking out over maps, including myself. But it's important to keep that in mind. You can't build something and only based off of your own personal views and your own personal visual decisions, because you're not the one that's going to be making decisions all the time. So it's good to think about who your audience is. What's the appropriate level of detail? Again, back to that China example, do you need to see every single style on a list, or do you need to see stores on a list? Do you need to understand if there are certain stores that are failing instead of the style? Do you need to go down to that level? That's really important when it comes to forming that data source that you're working with, because the level of detail that you need to create something compelling will impact the size of your data source, it'll impact the performance of whatever it is that you're trying to build. And you don't always need to assume that the lowest level of detail is the best. So say you're working with census data and you are trying to do a map of all the United States, state versus state. You don't really need the level of detail down to the census tract, right? Because you're just comparing one state versus the other state. It's that type of message that you need to think about before compiling your data and then before visualizing it in a certain way. And then lastly, obviously, how will they be consuming it? Will these be people that just want everything in Excel spreadsheets? That might be cool. You know, will they be people that want everything in a PowerPoint and just printable? Do they want to click around in something and have a interactive visualization, which things like Google Sheets are great for, or Tableau? You know, how will they be understanding and consuming the data? Will help frame your technology that you use, the visual itself, all of those different things. Okay, so design principles. The first and the most important is, and this is both for data visualization and web visualization, whatever sort of art that you're trying to make, whether it be data or not, placement is so incredibly important when it comes to designing something on a PowerPoint or whichever you're using. So as you can see, this first picture on the top right shows eye tracking across a website. And you can see the one is right over the man's face, and then they kind of move down and all over the website. But it starts with the face because from what I know, when it comes to websites or pictures or visuals, humans are immediately drawn to other humans' faces. So that's why it started right there at his face and kind of went back to it. And that's usually where people spend the most time. So if you ever Google like eye tracking for websites, you'll see almost any time that all of the red is concentrated right in the middle of the person's face. So that's one interesting point. But when it comes to, say, designing a dashboard or putting something on a PowerPoint with a bunch of charts, people's eyes, again, pretty much start up in the top left as they would if they were reading a book. And so it's usually most important to put your most compelling or most impactful or most important visual right in the top left portion of whatever it is that you're building. After that, then it kind of falls in the way that you would be reading something, left to right in the same way. Make it pop. So you can see again that Beatles one on the bottom on the right. It's really cool because here, if I make it bigger, I suppose it really pops out, right? So you can see all the great songs that Lennon did over time and how he had his time spread kind of throughout the entire Beatles period. Whereas it seems like, wait, no, is that Lennon? I'm kind of confused as to which one is which. Anyways, there's a lot of color being used here, and it's really cool to see. So certain things pop out, and that's wonderful. And we'll talk about color in a second, but it's important to make those important components of the visualization pop out so they understand what they're looking at right away. Whereas with this one over here, if we take a closer look at it, move that one to the side, sorry. There isn't a lot of popping coming out of this. It's pretty dull, it's pretty gray. There's some red over here, which, you know, is great. And you can kind of discern some stuff from down here, but all of the gray makes things kind of, you know, dissolved in comparison to like the Beatles one. So that's interesting to think about. And then the other component of this design principle to keep in mind is to limit unnecessary ink. So again, with this one over here, there's just so much going on and so many lines everywhere that it's really hard to pull away one message. It's like, where do I even start when I'm looking at this, and why is it so cluttered? It could be informative for some people, but I would look at that and be like, oh, there's too much here. So that's one good thing to think about as well. And then move that back there. When we think about color, there are two ways to break it up. First, just a simple use of color on the whole, and then also white space. So with the color component, while the Beatles one was pretty compelling, I got kind of confused with all the different colors that were being used. But if you stick to just a few, I think most bloggers would say 6 or so, and pretty much limiting to just one when it comes to representing something at the extreme, like not having an extreme blue and then an extreme red. That's really important. And then ensuring that that particular color is applicable to all other metrics that are conveying these same metrics. So if you have one graph that has net sales over time and it goes from green to red, you want to make sure any other component on the dashboard or on the visual that you're creating that uses net sales to go from that same green to red variation. So in this particular case over here, we have a very, very compelling use of the color red. Everything else on the dashboard is gray, but that red just makes it seem so intense and pretty compelling. And then with white space, that gets back to the color, which the color and the kind of clutteredness of the dashboard. So we can see on this one again that there's just so much going on and not a lot of white space. And so that makes things a bit difficult to pick apart because there's just too much there. So it's good to have some white space. Again, whether it be on your PowerPoint slides or on the dashboard that you're building, I think that helps a lot to hone in on whatever message it is that you're trying to say. And that was really all I had. So those type of things to keep in mind are great. Again, just sticking to simplicity is really good. And then thinking about what sort of message that you're trying to say is really the most important thing that you can do when you're building something out. So I think that's all I've got. Does anyone have questions or curiosities?
Yeah, I have a question for you. Using a tool like Tableau or MicroStrategy, have you ever found the need to include additional programming languages like R or something like that? Or have you pretty much relied on the visualizations inside those tools?
So the great thing about tools these days and the growth of R, which I'm a huge fan of R. I used it a lot in grad school and picked it up there. And it has some visualization components again, but they're honestly not that pretty. But the great thing about Tableau right now, as of the last few versions, is that you can actually build your own R code within Tableau and it'll process it for you. So R is mostly used for the analytics portion and not usually for visuals. And so being able to use that and write your scripts in Tableau increases the analytic abilities of Tableau immensely, which is great. So it really just depends on the use case. I actually haven't had, well, no, I lied. I did use it once about a year ago, which was nice. So again, you can use it. I think the tools are really increasing their breadth of programming languages. So
do you find that you're limited by the choice of tool with if you're working with a company that refuses to have their data in the cloud? Because I find with a lot of HR work that I do, they're very reluctant to have any of their data hosted in the cloud because of privacy issues.
Yeah, that's definitely a thing. And that's one of the main barriers to using a lot of these free source or open source tools. It's because, again, you're putting that data somewhere that the company can't control. So I've worked with like healthcare companies in the past where they don't, you can't put anything outside or in the cloud. So that hindrance, again, has an impact on the performance because once you put data in the cloud, it makes the visualizations that you're building and the access to the data a lot quicker. Once it's on-prem, then that has an impact on how you then build the data source to feed into the visualization because it needs to stay not in the cloud. So there are tools. Tableau can handle on-prem stuff and it can handle like Teradata or whatever it is that you're connecting to in the system. But does that help?
Yes, thanks.
Britt, I have a question.
Sure.
Well, I actually had a comment. I've worked for the government for close to 20 years, and it seems like, all of the work has been through Excel and workbooks. It seems like there is so much more available now, as far as data analysis and things. It makes me feel very inadequate as far as being able to, convey on such a large scale. I mean, how do you decipher which platform to use or which is the best?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Again, to Christopher's point, it kind of goes back to what the company is willing to invest in and how they're able to up-level their data visualization capabilities. So the government is a beast when it comes to that. So I'm sorry that you have to deal with it, but they are a bit antiquated in the tools that they use and the way that they're divvying up or even presenting data. I don't know if you've ever used this tool called Data Ferret, but it was literally built in like 1998, and the federal government still insists that everyone uses it. So when it comes to tool selection, honestly, at the end of the day, it comes down to budget and needs for trying to decide something for a client. Like I'm currently on a project that uses Chartio, which is a cool tool, and it allows you to write a lot of custom like SQL queries to build out the visualizations that you have, but it's immensely limited when it comes to customization. So if you have an audience that requires a lot of pretty visuals, then you're going to want something that's a bit more complex. But if you have an audience that really only needs to see really simple pie charts, some bar charts, etc., and they don't need it to be super interactive because all they're doing is putting it in PowerPoint anyways or printing it off for memos, you don't really need something that's like super fancy. So it really it depends. I think Garner, I think, has quite a few papers on that type of suitability type study. It's awesome. Would that answer your question?
So I have a question for you, one more about the type of tools and choices. Have you found that you needed to purchase your own tool because the company doesn't want to invest in a particular tool, but you really would like to use some of the features there? So do you have your own, stash of tools? Or because I know I've purchased some for myself that some of my companies don't want to purchase and I wind up using them my own.
Yeah, so that's a good question too. So I would say again, being a Tableau devotee, it's expensive to buy on your own. It would be like $1,000 for a license, I believe. But they also have Tableau Public, but you have to use public data sources and then publish to public sites, which you can't do when you're working for a company. But I would say things like Power BI, again, can be really helpful. That's not a desktop version, so I'm not sure if that would be a hindrance because you'd have to put your data technically on the Power BI platform to get it to work. Other than that, yeah, there are some cheaper ones out there. Again, there's the custom stuff that you could build on your own, which would take some time. And I haven't really Googled other open source tools that much. I used to use quite a bit. I had the same problem when I was doing a lot of mapping related work. So I used this tool called QGIS, which provided a lot of flexibility for mapping and is honestly superior to the ones that they have to pay for. So I would do a good search and read reviews. People are pretty vocal about what tools are good and which ones are bad.
I'm curious. You talked about cleaning data. In terms of your strategy for cleaning data, do you find what tools for that? If you have a data you want to normalize that has fields that don't match up and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my tool of choice to that extent is this data blending tool called Alteryx, and I guess if my screen is still being shown, again, you have to pay for it, which kind of sucks, but I think you can actually get free trial licenses, and if you're working for a company that is interested in lowering the amount of time that you have to spend on cleaning data, it can be super impactful. I've built models easily that reduce the amount of sales analyst time from 40 hours a week to just hitting play and then having it have the model run 10 minutes, and that saved them a week's of worth of work. So what it does then, I'm not sure if you can see, but it is that I have up. Can you see that what I'm looking at? Or is it still my PowerPoint?
It looks like a gray box right now, but I'm Googling Alteryx.
Yeah, you should. I know it said, wait, oh, here we go. There, okay. So this is Alteryx. It's a really cool mechanism for data blending and data cleaning. So you can see they've got like a fuzzy match over here. So if you have like a stream of customer names, and sometimes John spells his name John, but sometimes someone enters it and spells it Jon, you can do a fuzzy match on it, and it'll do it for you to clean it up. You can do all of these different joins. You can remove duplicates. You can sort. You can select fields. This tool is so cool to me, and it's seen a lot of surgeons in like the BI community. So if you have if you gain some experience in it, that could get you really far, because a lot of companies are using it now. Tools like R also are pretty helpful, but again, you'd have to know some programming language. But there are quite a few new tools that are coming out to help with data cleaning. Like Tableau is actually investing in its own data cleaning mechanism to pretty much bypass Alteryx, which is a little bit political, but whatever.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, exactly.
So I had a question that kind of tails on that. Do you guys have a go-to process when you're dealing with something where you might need like an API to interpret that, or do you just use this, or is there anyone else that you'd recommend for like developing an API to translate multiple formats into some report or something else?
Yeah, so again, that depends on the tool that you're using, because some visualization tools have connectors that will they've pretty much built their own API to say, have Excel scrape your Salesforce data, or have some other Tableau or Power BI or whatever pulled directly from your Google Sheets, so you don't have to build that API or like really do any coding on your own, which is nice. But again, this tool is really awesome because you don't have to do that again. But like, I've built web data connectors using Tableau's APIs to connect to things like government websites or tweets per hour, things like that.
Gotcha. Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah. No. That's it. Thanks.
Cool. I saw someone else had their hand raised. Oh, cool.
That would be me. So you're explaining API, and maybe I'm not familiar with the terminology, but of course, working for the government, there's a lot of acronyms on things, and this is why we are in college.
Yeah.
So can you explain a little bit more what you just discussed? Thanks.
Yeah, so an API is basically like the interface that you need to have to be able to connect to whatever's behind the interface. So Twitter's API is a certain, what's the best? It's always hard to describe APIs because I don't know. They're just these weird things that you have
it's like an architecture that you have to follow to connect to different data sources.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things, we're not here to become statisticians. I can't even say it. Statisticians. And and I'm definitely not, computer track when it comes to that. My background is business and finance, and so a lot of times I touch base with my IT department to help me, collect the data and provide the SQLs that will really make sense to my users, my audience, my clientele.
Yeah.
It really helps to understand, though, how to collect that data, analyze it, and convey it in a meaningful and hopefully understandable way. So, appreciate at least to have the tools and platforms available to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the API is definitely, or APIs in general, are definitely the things that would help you get to the data that you need. If it were living somewhere outside of your walls, or if it was on a certain platform like Salesforce, for example. Like Salesforce has its own API that you have to use in order to get to the data behind Salesforce. So it's like kind of like the wall that you kind of push through. But yeah, no, that's good. And finance data, I've worked with that. it can be really confusing if you're not a finance person. So,
Right. Thank you.
uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Anyone else have their hand raised? I thought I saw another one.
Britt, this is Desiree. I have a question for you. As far as when you're hired as a consultant and you're extracting data from, let's say, Salesforce, and you have data that's input incorrectly, how often are the companies going back and correcting that in the database itself so you're not just always bad data?
Yeah, so that's just one of those things that you Salesforce data it's always hard, it's messy. You have a whole, team of people behind the Salesforce development at a company that are working really hard to make sure that those fields are correctly populated, and they always aren't, because there are so many complexities behind Salesforce anyways. But in terms of building a visualization, what I typically then have to do is extract the data from Salesforce, clean it up, and do a lot of joins to make sure that the right say client or customer name and customer name is matched up to the right distributor, things like that, to really clean it up right before it goes into a visual, which is what a lot of sales analysts have to do anyways when they're extracting or running reports and then downloading the spreadsheets and then running all these VLOOKUPs on the spreadsheets from their Salesforce data. Automating that process is what I've done a couple of times to prevent people from having to download the spreadsheet and then clean up the data. If you're able to just clean up the data and make a model that does it for you, it helps companies a lot. And then it also helps the Salesforce developers to get a wireframe for what they need to do to improve Salesforce on the back end.
Do you find that you need to disclose that you've had to do heavy data cleanup when you present your work? Because I can see some of the systems I've worked in, I've presented some findings to HR people, and then they'll go back and try to duplicate what I've done for them, and they find they can't do it because their data's dirty. And I'm not cleaning up their system for them. I'm cleaning up what I'm working on. So do you find that you need to disclaim that you've done that?
Yeah, honestly, when it comes to working with clients, it shows up in how you build and distributed your time. So when at my prior company, when I worked with all those utilities, they'd give us a list of utility customers, and I would spend so many hours just cleaning up that data. And then I would talk to the client, and they're like, "Oh, what'd you do this week?" I'm like, "I spent literally 50 hours cleaning your messy data. Did you know it was this way?" And so, yeah, I had to disclose it, and I still do. I let them know straight up what's going on, because they need to know it too if they want to move and evolve as a company and make themselves more efficient and have anyone else use it too, because data at the end is power. So if they know that it's messy and then they clean it up and then other people can use it, that's just as impactful sometimes as the visuals themselves. So, yeah. Anyone else?
All right, Britt, I think I'll jump in here. Hey, it's Joseph again. Thanks, everybody, for spending the evening tonight. Thank you, Britt, for coming in tonight, talking a little bit about what you do. And thanks, everybody, for all the great questions you asked tonight. I know myself, as Britt talked, I've been trying to play around with Tableau. I only have a 14-day trial license, but we've been working this week on another client engagement I'm involved with, trying to normalize some data and try to get a way to visualize it for the client so it's consumable, and it portrays the story we're trying to portray. So learning Power BI and Tableau together at the same time this past 2 weeks has been quite a challenge because they both have their nuances. I can say I favor Tableau. I think one of the consultants I work with told me, however, though, if I can learn Power BI, then it'll be easy, because then once I step into the Cadillac of Tableau, it'll be much easier to work with that data. But it's been fun to try to find ways to visualize it, particularly in an interactive drill down fashion, so that it has meaning. But any last questions tonight before I don't want to burn down your time. I appreciated you giving us an hour tonight on a volunteer basis, so thanks for coming in. Any last questions for Brett?
You guys have my email if you ever want to reach out and follow up on any of the stuff or want to talk about tools. Always happy to help.
Just
And I'll
want to
post
say
any of the materials you've given us to the Foxtail.
And I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time and talking to us. I think it helps to understand the perspective of someone who's in this field and does this on a daily basis. So appreciate it.
Thanks. Yeah, it's fun to talk about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your evening.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.